catalysts, which was the focus of the article, How Field Catalysts Accelerate Collective Impact, which was recently published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So before we get started today, I'd like to just start with a land acknowledgement. So we begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. For those of us who are settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all of the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. This recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I am joining from Toronto, colonially known as Toronto. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political contexts embedded within the lands known as Canada, and commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. So for those of you who have already shared where you're joining from, please share again, what lands are you joining us from this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you're from. Next, just some technology housekeeping. We've got you covered. We will be resending a full recording of the webinar alongside any links and resources discussed in today's webinar. We'll have that follow-up email out to you later next week. We encourage everyone, please join the conversation. Share your thoughts, your comments, and questions within the chat box throughout the webinar. Don't hold on to those juicy questions. Please just share them as they come to your mind, and I'll make sure that we revisit them at the question period. And we do have some time at the end of today for questions. And then finally, technical support. My name is Connor Judge, and you can just use the chat client to direct message me, and I can answer any of your technical questions. So once again, welcome. And now it is my absolute pleasure to be introducing today's speakers. So first, I would like to introduce Sylvia Chu. So Sylvia is the Consulting Director of Collective Impact with the Tamarack Institute's Learning Center. She brings practical knowledge and firsthand experience to the work of multi-sector collaboration and community change. Next, I'd like to introduce Liz Weaver. Liz is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute and leads the Tamaracks Learning Center. She previously led the Vibrant Communities City Ending Poverty team and has worked at the community level as the director of the Hamilton Roundtable on Poverty Reduction. And finally, I'd like to introduce Mark Kabaj. Mark is the president of the consulting company From Here to There and a Tamarack Institute associate. He was the executive director of Vibrant Communities Canada, the precursor to the Cities Ending Poverty Network from 2002 to 2011. So welcome, Mark, Sylvia, and Liz. Thanks for being here this afternoon. And Sylvia, I'm now going to pass it to you. So please take us away.
Thanks so much, Connor. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see so many folks from all over the place joining us this afternoon. So I just want to set the stage a little bit before we dive in. So the intention behind this webinar is for us to sort of dive a little deeper into this notion of the field catalyst, which we wrote about in an article, as Connor mentioned, that was recently published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And for us, I think marking the 10th anniversary of Collective Impact led us to do a little bit of reflecting ourselves around Tamarack's experience and realize that we at Tamarack played a critical sort of bridging role, linking together local collective impact initiatives and really helping to amplify the effect towards systems change that these local efforts were working toward. And so we wanted to kind of document that, share some thoughts and ideas about it, and put it out to you all, the community change practitioners. And our hope for this afternoon is, after we sort of walk you through some of the key elements, to really engage you in a bit of a dialogue to get your feedback and input about how does this concept of the field catalyst really land for you? And if we were to continue to refine our thinking around it, what would you feel would be most helpful? So with that as a bit of a setting of context, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark, to take us away and walk us through the sort of core idea.
Great. Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, Tamarack team, for putting this on. To Sylvia and Liz for pushing for us to write this article, and for everyone jumping on the call today. I actually have a love-hate relationship with writing articles because they're a lot of work for the most part, as many of you know. but I like, so I don't like that. I don't like lots of work, but I do like the pressure of writing something because it forces you to get clear about what you think about something and if it's really quite meaningful and important. And so I did enjoy working with Liz and Sylvia on trying to say something about field catalysts. And it was prompted, as Sylvia noted, by the 10th anniversary, but also some very interesting research that came out concurrent to that on these ideas of intermediaries and field catalysts. And so my job is to take about 5 to 10 minutes to do some framing up of the bigger ideas. And then Sylvia, Liz is going to follow up with a concrete example of a field catalyst in work and how that helps place-based change efforts. And then Sylvia is going to take it home and talk about some version of looking forward and what the implications are. So I'm not an historian about this, but I know that field catalysts are a type of intermediary organization. And intermediary organizations, it's in the title, they intermediate. They intermediate between different organizations trying to do different things. And we're going to show you a visual of that shortly, of what we think that means for us. But they're not entirely new. They, in fact, for sure in the area of social development and poverty reduction, popped up in the 60s in the States when, in order to support place-based poverty reduction, all these intermediaries emerged to support place-based effort in the area of financing, technical assistance, capacity building, and research. And so their job was to fulfill kind of a infrastructure function to improve place-based work. So that's been around for quite some time. The Bridgespan group recently, well, I don't know how recently, a couple of years ago, did some work on intermediaries, and they spotted a new kind of intermediary called a field catalyst. Now, whether or not it was entirely new, at least we gave it a name, so it appeared to be new, so it's probably been around for a while. But when we reviewed that research, we thought, boy, oh boy, that helps us understand the work of Tamarack a little bit better. And the job of a field catalyst is really to, what we think, weave together the best of bottom-up and top-down approaches, and we're going to argue that you need both. So with that in mind, just that we're going to give you a glimpse on the next slide here of the different kinds of intermediaries. And this is an adaptation of the article that is also in Stanford Social Innovation Review. And we really encourage you to take a look at that original article from the Bridgespan group. So they talk about capability specialists. And I actually think that would be the first generation of intermediaries in social change. Again, policy change, learning how to do research and development, how to be an intermediary for financing different kinds of initiatives. So there's lots of capability specialists. There's evidence-based action labs, which many of you in the field of human-centered design and social innovation labs will know. This is to develop and test and if possible, contribute to the scaling of innovative solutions. That's a niche kind of intermediary role. There's more to do than that, but that's literally working on promising solution. There's place-based backbone work, which anyone on the call who knows about collective impact knows about the backbone organization. And this says at the local level, someone is sort of the supporter or the general contractor of a change process, even while you have all these specialist organizations coming and going. Who does the coordinating, the curating of a local change effort? And that's largely place-based. And sometimes place gets really big. It could be a region of a city. It could be a region. And I've even seen place-based work happen at a country level if it's a relatively small country. The final one is the field catalyst. And this actually, there's a nuance here. The field catalyst does whatever is required drawing on multiple capabilities to influence and augment and to push a entire field forward. And we think that's what Tamarack is in general around place-based change, as well as poverty reduction. And many of you on the call also have fulsome or partial dimensions of field catalyst. There are some examples on Canadian examples and some international examples, but this is just to confirm field catalyst is one type of intermediary. It's not better or worse than the other ones. It's just different. It does different things. So we'll go to the next slide, go a little bit further on this. And I think another thing to keep in mind as we talk about field catalyst is it's happening in a cultural soup that exists right now, where it is very evident that if we're in the game of generating transformational outcomes, we are in the game of systems change. How does one push and nudge and even transform systems. And so there's a bunch of good notes on here from Tim Drayman, who was one of the earlier animators and popularizers of the idea of intermediaries and field building and field catalyst and systems change. And so in some ways, his stuff was very prescient when he started talking about this a bunch of years ago. We're always catching up to Tim, it seems like. But we field catalysts are not just there to support incremental work, they're hopefully there to help amplify and accelerate transformational work, which means changing systems. So just a summary, intermediaries have always been around. We're seeing this emergence of field catalysts, and field catalysts are really important, but field catalysts are especially important if we agree that we're in the game of systems change. So let's go one more slide. And what we're going to do now is show you one more mashup of a diagram. Now, some people will get nauseous and grab some gravel because this is a busy diagram, but we want to talk a little bit about it. And we actually adapted this from something developed by Michael Quinn Patton in his very first book on developmental evaluation. And we retailed it a bit more to the Tamarack context. And so there's a couple of things to look at. See in the middle there, Tamarack Institute working at two levels, supporting local efforts and engaging policies and systems at a larger national and regional level. And this is important because a lot of, there's a bit of ideological work that happens even in the world of transformation and systems change. On one hand, there's sort of pure bottom-up vistas. That's not even a phrase, is it, Liz? But people who, Liz and Sylvia, who love bottom-up work and who say, look, we should be empowered. We know where local ice is thin. We should be driving the change process, and you bozos from the outside don't even know what's going on here. So how are you going to drive a change process? Well, that's true. It's just not entirely true, because people who are more working in bigger institutions saying, you know what, there's bigger tectonic forces going on that you can't move on your own. There's really good insight to be gleaned from looking at the work from 30,000 feet. We see patterns that you can't at the local level. We have connections and knowledge and resources that are simply not available at the local effort. So the issue is, we're not romanticizing bottom up or top down. We're saying that they have to work in conjunction as a field catalyst. And one way of looking at this is a dynamic process of what Michael Quinn Patton would call navigating the middle, with four big functional areas. Number one, field catalysts understand the field and engage system actors. What's going on? What does the research say? What kind of knowledge is really, really useful that on the ground? Where are there resources that could be deployed to support local-based efforts? What simply is going on at 30,000 feet that can be wholesaled in terms of support to the local change-based efforts, and then somehow retailed by local place-based initiatives? And that's where function 2 is. To strengthen the capacity of local collective impact initiatives or any place-based work to do the local work, broker and administer funding, convene learning community processes, coaching, technical assistance, networking, tools, workshops, delivery of frameworks. These are all useful inputs into local place-based efforts that, again, have to be adopted and adapted to the unique context by the local players. So we've even seen in Tamarack, there's field catalyst community campaigns, poverty, cities reducing poverty, communities building social capital. So we can even organize it around campaigns. And in Tamarack's case, there's also a learning center. So that's pretty interesting. Now, lots of stuff happens in communities, and some of it's not easy to make sense of it. So there's a third function involved. Make the work of place-based change in general, or collective impact in particularly, more visible, coherent, and robust. So anyone who's been involved in this work knows that there's a massive variation in how collective impact efforts, for example, work on the ground. And we know that for sure in the field of poverty reduction. Who looks for the patterns? Who tries to make sense of them and to ask with communities what seems to work in what context and not, and why? This is also a piece of work, to make work visible, to look for patterns and to make sense of what's going on in local efforts, because it also creates a condition for the last thing. With that information, systems don't change on their own. And some of you will quite rightly and understandably want to say nudge is not strong enough a word. Nudge or push or demand larger systems to change. To say, look what's happening on the ground. If you want to support place-based efforts in general, or you want to work on this particular problem, here's what we've been able to glean and distill on the ground. And we have a change agenda with you. Reshifting policies, reorienting how money is spent, investments are made, and where adjusting authority, etc. We broker those supports in round one, but we also nudge and push and try to transform those supports in phase two. Now, this is a very dynamic process. We labeled it 1, 2, 3, 4, but you can tell that it could start with 4 and go to 1. We know that 3 times sometimes backslides into number 2. So it's a much more dynamic process on this. But we kind of like this busy diagram because it made a little bit more visible, at least what Tamarack does. And we know from watching others what many of you do. Now, let's make this a little bit more practical. And we're going to turn it over to Liz, who's going to talk about living wage.
Thanks so much, Mark. And if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about living wage, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about how this diagram applies to Tamarack as a whole and how it has really helped, crystallize for us some of our thinking, particularly as it relates to our vibrant community partners, and then the work of the Learning Center as well. And so if we go to the next slide, many of you on the call will probably have seen this slide before, but this really is the 2 parts to Tamaracks work. We have our work that happens at the local community level. We call it broadly vibrant communities, and it's focused on ending poverty, deepening community, building youth futures, and climate transition. So we have 4 fields of practice or 4 campaigns that we're supporting. We started in our early days with a small group of communities, 12, in our vibrant communities ending poverty work. And now that has really grown quite significantly over the last 20 years. And then the Learning Center really is that opportunity to do some of that sense making, that pattern recognition, the looking not only at what's happening across vibrant communities, but also what's happening across the field. And how do we bring the knowledge and practice of the field into our vibrant communities work, but also share the vibrant communities work out with, other field builders who may not necessarily be directly engaged with us right away, or may be really interested in, not only this knowledge, but thinking about their role as field catalysts. And I think that was, Mark, that was one of the reasons why we thought about this as a topic for this paper, was to take some of what we were thinking at Tamarack, apply it with the collective impact lens, and share it with the field so we could, continue to engage in a dialogue about this. If we go to the next slide, you'll get a sense of, our communities ending poverty, because we did use that as a case study within the paper. So our Communities Ending Poverty Network is a network that is largely across Canada, and more than 400 communities across Canada. We have some communities in the US that are connected to the Communities Ending Poverty Network. It's been going for 20 years. Probably about 8 to 9 years ago, we had supported and convened a community of practice around living wage. Because one of the things that we knew when we looked at the data around living wage, particularly in the Canadian context, is that there is a significant portion of people that are working low wage jobs. So they're working full and part-time, but not earning enough that take them over this mythical poverty line. And so it provides an opportunity, by advocating for a living wage campaign, it provides an opportunity to move folks and their families out of poverty and into, more affordability within their communities. And so we convened folks across Canada into a community of practice to talk about, what was going on in Canada around living wage, and what was happening in the US around advancing living wage campaigns, and also what was happening in the UK, because those were the bright spots. We were looking to our colleagues in the US and to our colleagues in the UK. And then we started to talk about, could we do more than be engaged in a community of practice? What if we developed a shared approach, recognizing that provinces and territories across Canada have different ways of calculating a living wage? Could we come up with a set of principles around a calculation that would enable this movement to grow. And so with our partners in the community of practice, we started and brought in some other experts from the outside, started to build this kind of shared approach to calculating the living wage. The group then built and hosted the living wage website. The community started to engage and continue to engage employers who are, at the front end of the curve and advancing living wage within their employment, within their companies and businesses. And we continue as Tamarack to support that. So in many ways, what started as an idea that was really based on trying to move people out of poverty grew into this kind of catalytic movement forward that continues today. And there are now over 900 employers that have signed up across a whole variety of communities that are living wage employers, and we continue to build out that network. And so that's really taking this notion of bringing people together, talking to them, looking at what we might be able to do together, moving over to being much more proactive around that, and then nudging the system. Because what we've also learned in terms of nudging the system is that as Tamarack and our community partners began to advance living wage, there were other conversations happening in Canada around minimum wage and around basic income. And so the living wage work started to influence those other conversations in Canada. And all of them lead to moving people from one level of poverty out of poverty. And so this work is really about catalyzing the field. So that's a kind of an example that we thought was helpful when we were thinking about, okay, how did we actually work our way through those dimensions that Mark talked about? If we go to the next slide, this slide really shows you that not only are we focused at in the ending poverty work at reducing poverty across Canada, but the work, this kind of catalyzing of work happens in so many different ways, right? So living wage is one of those areas, but across the 400 communities that we partner with, some of the communities are involved in transportation initiatives, others are involved in housing initiatives, others are involved in mental health and well-being initiatives. And as we start to look and pull together the progress that we're making collectively as a movement, and also looking at how the system is being nudged as a result of all these communities doing this work, we can see some really interesting trends that the vibrant communities ending poverty communities are contributing to. They're not the only group that is contributing to them. They're one of many inputs, but we're seeing really positive trends. And we know that our work is, our collective work is making a difference. Let's go quickly to the next slide before I turn it over to Sylvia. This gives you just a little bit more background information about Tamarack and some of the ways that we are really having an influence, not only in the vibrant communities work, but in the field catalyst work more broadly. And then the final slide that I wanted to kind of take folks to, so one more slide, if we can move it forward, is just some lessons that I shared a couple of weeks ago with a group in Germany that was really interested in, this idea of field catalysts. And the lessons that I shared kind of are ones that, Mark might disagree with or Sylvia might disagree with, but ones that I've kind of been thinking about. So the things that I consider are that we really need to connect this local place-based work as a way of creating scale, right? So the role of a field catalyst really can do that in a purposeful kind of way, but we can only do it when those place-based efforts are connected together with one another, and that there is sense making happening with those connected efforts. If they're happening just randomly and there's no one kind of pulling them together, then maybe the assumptions or the things that we're realizing don't really reflect their work. And so there is a lot of that work that has to happen. We also know at Tamarack, and Mark talked about this earlier, that local context is really important, right? So what works in one community might not necessarily work in the same in another community, because there's a different context there. There is a different leadership. A community might have different kinds of priorities that they're focused on. There might have been something really pivotal in that community, but you can see patterns, right? So the more communities you engage, the more patterns you can see. I think that one of the things that we've built into the model at Tamarack and the approach is this kind of connection between communities and the coaching support. So as we've launched our Communities Building Youth Futures work, working deeply with communities has really led to them scaling their work much quicker. Common themes emerge from local variations. And then I think, what's interesting and unique to the Tamarack approach is that some of this work is funded by all of you who participate in Tamarack's learning, whether you attend, our fee-paying workshops or engage with us in consulting services. So, you're investing in all of this work, and it's really the entrepreneurial piece that enables the learning center and the capacity building part of the work to happen at Tamarack. And so we often think about ourselves as a cooperative model, and the cooperative model is because of that investment, that entrepreneurial investment, and that entrepreneurial strategy that happens through Tamarack. And so I want to thank you all for your support, those of you that have participated in workshops, but also recognize that field building takes resources, and we really have to, think about not only the resources that we have invested in us through philanthropic partners, but sharing out that learning is a really critical part of this. And so that is, I think, really important. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sylvia, to bring us home on this.
Thanks so much, both Mark and Liz. I really like the theory piece, and then really anchoring it both in terms of the practical work and example, but also in terms of what it really takes to resource and make this work happen in reality. So it's been fun for me to watch all the comments flowing through from everyone, because there's one of the conversations or themes that's coming up is that there are many similar field catalyst roles or titles or concepts, and lots of questions, right, about how is what we're presenting here different or similar to some of these other frames. And for me, that's always a sign that this is still an emerging idea. Like, we're still playing with this, we're still refining it, we're not sure. And the dialogue today is about helping us better understand from you all, does this fit? So as we were thinking about this, one of the things that we were also thinking about is what's ahead. When we look at what's happening in communities, when we look at various collective impact initiatives and where the maturity is around that practice, what more do we think that the field catalyst role needs to either refine or embrace as part of its contribution? And we kind of zeroed in on 3 different things. If you want to just jump ahead 1 second, Connor. So one of them is, one of the things that we think needs more exploration is this notion about, that bottom up capacity building, linking of place-based efforts, and the leadership, the systems leadership role with the other system actors. And one of the powerful things, I think, is that there is a dynamic flow between all 4, but all 4 are present and a focus of effort for the field catalyst. The tension or challenge is it's often not easy to know exactly when. It's best to stay in that capacity building role when systems leadership is needed, and how to navigate smoothly between all 4 of those elements. So learning how to be more skillful about that, I think, is something we'd love to explore in more depth. And the second one is, given the dynamic nature of community and some of the social pressures that are confronting us, one of the things we were wondering about is how might we better support with new tools, with new frameworks, with new approaches, the pressure that so many of us are under to generate powerful impact on a number of really important community issues. And so what is it that we can do to help support that agility? Is it about better kind of reading the field and noticing shifts and changes? Is it about capacity building? It's probably some of all. And I think the last piece that we're starting to think about and recognize, particularly as we've seen collective impact initiatives spring up everywhere, is that is now more often than not likely that there are multiple collective impact initiatives operating in the same geographic space. And an ongoing question is, when does it make sense for these collective impact initiatives to align with each other? When does it make sense for them to integrate their work? When does it make sense for them to sort of just work in parallel? And what's the role of the field catalyst in helping to both navigate, like help the different collective impact initiatives learn about, know about, connect with each other? And do they have anything to bring forward to helping kind of explore the options for how these different initiatives link themselves together most effectively? So those are the big questions that are still kind of bubbling out there. Anything, Liz, Mark, you would add on that before we dive in to the next piece? Nope. Okay. So now we're going to turn it over to you all. We're going to start with a poll if you want to leap ahead. What we are really hungry to hear from you first and foremost is, how clear is the concept of the field catalyst to you as we've laid it out, with 5 being extremely clear and 1 being not clear at all? If you could let us know based on your own impression, where are we? Great. I think we're starting to slow down a little bit there. When you think we've got everyone we're going to hear from, Connor, please go ahead and share the poll. Someone, beautiful. Okay, so it's feeling, the majority of you feel it's very clear, which is great. Those of you for whom it feels somewhat clear, and or all of you actually, it'd be really helpful if you could add a few comments into the chat around what it is that you would like to see being made clearer. I saw someone put something in as, yeah, it feels pretty clear as a concept, but we need a new title. All in for that. So any thoughts and ideas you have to contribute to that would be really helpful. And then now we want to, before we turn it over to you to ask open-ended questions, we had a couple of questions for you. So if we can, the first question is, how does the role of the field catalyst shift how you are thinking about systems change and systems transformation? Give you some time to think about that. How are your thoughts and ideas shifting about this concept? Go ahead, chat. Feel free to type in comments, questions, thoughts into the chat box. Okay. Some good stuff coming in already, which is great. Oh, Laura, great question. Is the field catalyst a person, a strategy, or a function within an organization? And I think it's probably a blend of all three. How would you answer that one, Liz? What would you say?
So where I think it is, it can be all three, actually. It can be a blend of all three. I think it really depends on looking back at that slide that Mark shared around the typologies, right? So the typologies are really interesting because there are, even in the intermediaries, there are different approaches, different kind of catalyzing approaches that one organization or a set of organizations sometimes might take in terms of advancing a field of practice or moving it forward. At Tamarack, we're playing around with this idea that, because we have now 4 areas where we're focused on, is it about building movements of people who are interested in ending poverty or building youth futures or navigating climate transition? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, language is important, right? And so I can see that thread appearing throughout the comments.
Absolutely. I know I think about the distinct roles, all of which are important. And I can imagine that, it is a person, but different people within an organization may have strengths in each one of those 4 functions. So my sense is, yes, it's individuals, but individuals within a team or network that can touch on all 4 of those important contributions. Want to weigh in on this one, Mark?
Maybe just adding some, agreeing and adding some texture. I kind of, that diagram that we created makes me think that it is a cluster of functions whose value is very context specific. How those functions are applied depends on the issue and the time. And it really requires, this phrase, I'm so preoccupied with it lately, because you know it when you see it and you know when it's not there. Someone who knows a stewardship style that curates a change process, the curation of a change process. Right, it's not just fulfilling functions. I mean, that's part of it, but how much, when, and how. And I know that Liz and Sylvia, we've heard feedback that Tamarack will be even more powerful in the future if it spends even more time on cluster 4, like pushing systems, right? That we spend a lot of time supporting groups, but there is real pressure for transformation to do more in the nudging or the pushing of systems. So I do think it's multiple functions fulfilled in the right way at the right time for the right context that requires really good curation. That's why I've actually never loved the word even backbone, even though I get it. It captures a lot of what we're doing, but that sounds too passive. Like everyone on the ground, when you see someone stewarding a change process in a meaningful collective way, they're curating a change process. There's a bigger story going on than just fulfilling some functions.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment here. I'm not sure, but where I saw it, but there was something about, can the field catalyst, can someone who's championing a local effort also see themselves as a field catalyst? And for me, one of the thoughts that I have about that is reflecting on when I was sort of on the front line doing this work in my own community and harnessing things, how difficult it was to toggle back and forth between being on the ground, doing the nuts and bolts. These are the things we have to do to advance the strategy we're committed to, and then having the ability to easily kind of come up to a higher vantage point and sort of see patterns, see opportunities, and more effectively evaluate opportunities to shift strategy. And so I can sort of see a value in that role being distinct from the actual place-based on the ground stuff, right? Just to help you hold different perspectives.
There's a really interesting question that Maria has put in the chat box around, how does one have authority to convene, and, what happens in that case? And I think, that sometimes authority is granted, but sometimes you have to build trust with like partners to gain kind of some of that credibility. I wouldn't even call it authority, because I think that it really is paying attention to what the group thinks is important. So in the living wage example that I shared with everybody, we convened the conversation about living wage, but it was really the decision of the group to say, should we pull together a national living wage calculator, right? So if the group wasn't behind that, that would have never happened, right? So I think it is one of those things where you can convene people, but then it is the purposeful engagement of them and their leadership, because there were some, at the time, if I recall the story correctly, there was some really exciting practice happening in British Columbia around living wage, and they were leading out in Canada around that. And then we were able to partner with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And so it was some of those key strategic partners that were leaning in and bringing resources to the table that helped that group advance. So the convening of the community of practice is what we did, but then it was really engaging the community of practice to identify what they wanted to do together next and collectively moving it forward.
That's beautiful. There's some, thank you, everybody. I'm kind of, as you're speaking, also sort of seeing how what you're saying is sparking other people's thinking and thoughts and ideas about this, about the concept, about the roles. Lots of energy around the change curator kind of concept, Mark, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously I'm just trying to see what else is emerging here.
Sylvia, we have 3 questions in the Q&A box as well.
Oh, let's go there, shall we? What do we got? This role is resource intense, as Christopher Thompson says, and demands sophisticated capacity. How do you think funding can be sustained for this work?
Yeah, that was my comment about having an entrepreneurial part of it, right? Because I do think, you know, the piece around supporting the community of practice and the place-based work is attractive to funders. It's that kind of catalytic or curating or knowledge translation or whatever language we use around that. That is more challenging to resource. And so I do think, you know, that really leads into, I think, a bigger conversation with philanthropists and others who are interested in investing in, you know, learning more about how we do that effectively and how that can advance a field.
I agree completely. And it also makes me think about the Collective Impact Project in Montreal as an interesting example, right? Where they convened a round table of 8 funders who created an investment pool over many years specifically for these neighborhood-based collective impact initiatives. But it was because it was a small contribution within their overall granting bucket, right? It did not prevent them from continuing to invest in a number of programmatic kind of initiatives that also met their mandate. So I think there might be something there too around pooled funding to kind of resource some of this stuff. Okay.
Before you go on, Sylvia,
yeah.
before you go on, I know, Mark, you did some research around that for a group in Australia around kind of resourcing this catalytic role, whatever, curation role.
I was interviewed by researchers in Australia, and my response was that I thought there was probably different archetypical models for resourcing field catalysts, and I think Tamarack has one way of doing it. And so I don't think there's, like everyone, there's no one right model. Number 2, no one's particularly happy with their model. I know that. And number 3, it doesn't matter because it's probably going to change anyways. And so mostly people just cope as best they can with the model they have, but some models are stronger than others. And it's field catalyst work is very difficult to frame and get funded because people understandably want to fun work that's closer to the ground and visceral and tangible. So it's a workout to do field catalyst work.
All right. Well, I see we have someone with their hand up. I don't know if the person with their hand up, I'm trying to see who they are, could maybe type your question into the chat box, perhaps, just so we can see and hear and get it captured on the recording. But there's a really great question here from Nicole. So I'm going to read this one out and invite your comment. Could you explain how one would recognize the difference between someone being a field catalyst, a specialist, or a consultant? Do field catalysts know that they're field catalysts? What's your thought on that, Liz?
I'm going to defer to Mark. Mark, what are your thoughts?
Okay, Nicole, very good question. And I retain the right to change my mind in 5 minutes from now. But here's my first go at it. Because it's a good question. I kind of feel like a field catalyst is more like a platform that's able to fulfill multiple functions. It's got more of a multi-dimensional feel about it. A specialist is someone that is designed to do something, right? Like SRDC in Canada is a specialist intermediary in doing evidence-based research and scaling of programs. Like that, they're specialists. They don't, doesn't mean they don't make a contribution to the field, but they have a very specialist contribution. And I think a consultant can be catalytic, but I don't think they have the power of a full-fledged platform, number one. And the full-fledged platform, again, has this ability to be highly responsive to the situation and do what needs to be done at a given point. It's got multiple tools to do what needs to be done. I kind of feel like it's always nudging and pushing, drawing on whatever tools it needs at the moment. So platform versus surgical contribution by a specialist versus a consultant who can be catalytic, but doesn't have the power of a platform behind them.
I'd build on that in that I could imagine a field catalyst calling on a specialist or specialist calling on a consultant to help round out. Like if I think about the living wage example, right? Building out the calculator probably involved some highly specialized expertise, some research from other places, and you may actually contract out someone to do some initial thought work that then can be tested with the field, right? Yeah. So that would be one dimension. And I think for me, the other dimension that really starts to come into play is specialists and consultants, I don't think by definition would focus always on the field. Like they may by chance, whereas a field catalyst is really kind of taking that horizontal view and looking up and sort of linking, as you said, the top, you know, the bottom up and the top down kind of work in catalytic ways. That's what I would add to that, I think.
Sylvia, I'm just going to make one quick riff on there because Paul Toner used the phrase that triggered something from me. I think a field catalyst wouldn't start with the question as with what do I need to do? A field catalyst, if I think operating at its best, people would say what needs to be done in this field right now. Right? That's very situational. Who is doing what in the field, right? And therefore, how can we add crazy value right now, drawing on multiple tools and functions? So they would be, it really is, Paul, like whatever it takes, but it doesn't start, a specialist might say, look, I'm really good at evidence-based stuff, so I'm going to do more evidence-based stuff. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not as, I don't think it's required to be as highly situationally responsive as a good field catalyst. I would say the shadow side is a crappy field catalyst, wouldn't even ask those questions. They would just fulfill functions without trying to be responsive and paying attention to what others are doing.
Beautiful. Well, I am mindful of the time. So in the 2 minutes we have remaining, I think we can say thank you to everyone for these great comments, chats. We'll make sure to include that in the material that we send along, and you've given us lots to think about. So stay tuned and we'll see how our thinking gets nudged forward based on your insights and wisdom. Thank you. Liz, last comments, any?
I just want to thank Mark and you, Sylvia, and particularly you, Sylvia, because you stewarded us through the process of writing together. And I think I agree with Mark. It was really a crystallization of some of the things that we are thinking about at Tamarack. And, you know, for us, and you mentioned this, Sylvia, this is only, you know, maybe step 4 in our thinking today. Your questions, all of you in this big virtual room, your questions are going to prompt us even further. And we would love to engage in deeper conversations with those of you that would like to help us think this through as well, because you know, this, I think, is the beginning of a conversation for us at Tamarack, and certainly something we're engaging our board and our staff and others in more deeply. So, you know, reach out. Let's have a virtual coffee together and let's talk some more. But thank you, Sylvia, for your stewardship, and Mark.
Thank you so much, Liz. Mark, thank you. Last words.
Not for me. Thank you. I enjoyed it all. These were great questions. I like the format.